Welcome to Candlelight Mysteries, a place where shadows whisper secrets and every flicker of the flame hides a tale untold. Tonight, beneath the glow of a single candle, we will journey into a story filled with suspense, secrets, and timeless intrigue. Before we begin, I'd love to know a little about you. Where are you listening from and what drew you to the world of mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's build a circle of mystery lovers together. If you enjoy tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing Candlelight Mysteries family. Here, every flame carries a story waiting just for you. Now let us step quietly into the darkness and begin. Chapter 1. The Uneasy Scrape. Beneath the floorboards, it began with a sound, so faint, so irregular, that Miss Marple at first took it for a trick of the wind. The clock on her mantel had just struck 11:30 when she heard it again, a thin, deliberate scrape somewhere beneath the sitting-room floor. For a moment she sat perfectly still in her armchair, her knitting needles paused mid-click. The night fire had burned down to a soft orange glow, and the only other noise in the cottage was the sleepy tick of the clock. Then came the scrape once more, measured, not frantic, like someone drawing a spade across hard earth. Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed just slightly. "Most inconvenient for a mouse," she murmured to herself. "I seldom keep appointments." She rose, wrapped her shawl more tightly about her shoulders, and peered toward the hearth. Nothing seemed amiss, no movement, no shifting of ash or brick. Still, that sound had the unmistakable rhythm of human effort. She listened a final time, holding her breath. Silence. By morning, with sunlight filtering across her neat sitting room, the noise might have been forgotten had she not found a faint sprinkling of grit on the rug near the skirting board. At breakfast, she spread marmalade on her toast with delicate precision and decided the matter would bear a little polite investigation. Later that morning, over tea with the vicar's wife, Miss Marple mentioned the noise as casually as one might mention a change in the weather. "I dare say it was a mouse," said Mrs. Clement indulgently. "Though you do keep things awfully tidy, Jane," Miss Marple smiled. "Mice, yes. But I've never known a mouse to use a shovel." "And I've known quite a few," the vicar's wife laughed. Not entirely certain it was a joke, the conversation drifted to parish matters, then to the small scandal of Mrs. Linton's new hat. Bought in Bath, I'm told, but far too youthful for her complexion. And finally, to the builders resurfacing the lane near the cottages. "They're a rough lot," Mrs. Clement said, stirring her tea with quiet vigour. "Mr. Pritchard told me they've dug up half the verge already. Apparently there was once another property marked there, though who ever heard of that?" Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-air. "Another property?" "Yes, some old survey map from before the war." "I expect they're mistaken." "Quite possibly," said Miss Marple, with that mild tone which in her case meant the exact opposite. That afternoon, the village air smelled faintly of tar and cut grass as she walked to the high street. Her errands were simple: wool, tea, and perhaps a new ribbon for her straw hat, but she paused by the grocer's window where Mr. Pritchard was conferring with one of the workmen. "You see, it's marked right there," he was saying in a low, excited voice. Odd boundaries looping round Miss Marple's very cottage. Miss Marple's hand, which had been reaching for a jar of barley sugar, stopped midway. She turned, smiling politely as if she'd heard nothing of consequence. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pritchard," she said sweetly. He jumped a little. "Oh, Miss Marple. Lovely weather, isn't it?" "Nothing at all to trouble about. Just talking of the council's maps." "Such a comfort when the council knows where everything is," she said, eyes twinkling. "Though I do find they often misplace a road or a house." She left him pink and flustered, humming to herself as she returned home. The gate to her cottage creaked as she lifted the latch, and that was when she noticed it, a faint scuffing along the brass, not rust nor age, but but the shiny diagonal scratch of recent use. And from the angle of the mark, she could tell it had been made by a left-handed person, and in rather a hurry. Inside, the air held a trace of cool damp, like turned earth. She knelt by the skirting board where the grit had been, brushing her fingers lightly across the rug's edge. There was nothing new to see, but she fancied the faintest echo like a hollow space beneath. The clock struck 3. Outside, a cart rattled past, and somewhere a dog barked. Ordinary village sounds. Yet the cottage felt as though it were listening with her. That evening brought a drizzle and a quiet visit from young Mary, the maid who came twice a week to help with errands. Beg pardon? Miss, Mary said, wringing her hands, but someone's been walking round the side path. I saw footprints by the kitchen wall clear as anything. Miss Marple looked up from her darning. Really, my dear? And when was this? This morning before the rain started. Big boots they were. Not the postman's either. He always cuts across the green. Very observant of you, Mary. Miss Marple gave a small, approving nod. Did you happen to notice if the prince went toward the lane or back toward the gate? Mary frowned, thinking hard. Back toward the gate, I'd say. As if whoever it was had changed their mind about knocking. How sensible of them, Miss Marple murmured. Most people only change their minds too late, Mary blinked, uncertain whether that was meant kindly. When Mary had gone, Miss Marple lit her lamp and took out her knitting. Though she scarcely saw the pattern for her thoughts, there were connections forming, thin threads, easily missed, a scraping under the floor, odd boundary lines, a stranger's boots by her kitchen wall. None yet sinister, but suggestive. She remembered the way Mr. Pritchard's voice had dropped when he mentioned the map, and the way Mrs. Clement had laughed a little too quickly when she'd spoken of it. People, Miss Marple knew, did not lower their voices over things of no interest. At 9:30, she locked the door, pulled her curtains tight, and sat once more in her chair by the dying fire, and then, quite suddenly, there came a soft rustle at the letter slot. Something thin and stiff slid onto the mat. Miss Marple waited until the footsteps had faded away before she stooped to pick it up. It was a postcard, yellowed with age, the corners brittle. Across the front was a faded picture of her own cottage, except that beneath it, in looping black script, were the words, Rosemere Lodge, St. Mary Mead. Her eyebrows lifted. Rosemere Lodge, not a name she had ever heard for her house. She turned the card over. The back was blank, save for a faint watermark and a date pressed into the paper, 1908. She set it gently on the mantel and stood a long while, listening to the steady tick of the clock. The next morning, the village was alive with gossip. At the bakery, someone said the builders had found a rusted key in the ditch. At the post office, Mrs. Gubbins declared the key belonged to some smuggler's hidey-hole. You mark my words. Miss Marple listened with polite amusement, though her mind was busy turning the matter of Rosemere Lodge over and over like a teacup in her hand. By afternoon, she decided to pay a visit to Mr. Pritchard, under the innocent pretext of buying candles. Awfully odd business. That map, he told her, still clearly excited, shows a large property where your cottage is, with boundary walls and a well marked here, though there's no well now, is there? Oh, perhaps filled in, Miss Marple said mildly. These things often are, when they no longer suit the convenience of the house. She tucked the candle packet into her basket and looked at him over her spectacles. You wouldn't happen to recall who made the map, would you? He blinked. Can't say I do. Council paper, though. Early century, I'd reckon, I see, she said softly. Quite early indeed. She left him to his shelves and hurried gossip and walked home slowly through the fading afternoon. The rain had ceased and mist curled low along the hedges. Her cottage looked perfectly ordinary, flowers nodding, curtains drawn halfway, smoke curling from the chimney. Yet something about it felt changed, as though a secret had been whispered too near the walls. On the doorstep lay a smear of chalky mud, not the brown of the lane, but pale, granular, like the earth from deeper ground. Miss Marple stooped, touched it lightly and straightened with a thoughtful expression. Inside, she set the candles on the table, made herself a cup of tea, and took up her knitting once more. The fire crackled, the kettle hummed, and the clock struck 6. Everything in its place, and yet beneath that cosy domestic peace, a question pulsed quietly, like a heartbeat. Who had slipped the old postcard under her door, and why bring back the forgotten name of Rosemere Lodge? Outside, the wind stirred the garden gate so it clicked faintly against its latch, the sound almost, but not quite, the same as that first night's scraping from beneath her floor. Miss Marple looked toward the hearth and smiled her gentle, knowing smile. For she understood now that the sound she'd heard was not the noise of mice nor pipes, but the unmistakable beginning of mischief, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful. Chapter 2. Tea leaves and old names. It was a bright, wind-brushed morning when Miss Marple stepped into Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room, a place where gossip settled faster than tea leaves at the bottom of a cup. The fire was cheerful, the cushions plump, and a faint scent of lavender polish lingered on the furniture, though even that pleasant fragrance could not disguise the sharper tang of curiosity in the air. "Jane, my dear, you simply must try this sponge," declared Mrs. Bantry, already slicing a generous wedge. "Cook put in a touch of almond essence, though between us I think she's been heavy-handed." Miss Marple smiled as she took her seat. "A touch too much almond can be very telling, Dolly. It announces itself." "As do some people," Mrs. Bantry said meaningfully, glancing toward the window. "Mrs. Linton, for instance. She's been into the Bell Inn every afternoon this week. Calls it charity work, but one wonders what form that charity takes." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, though her sharp blue eyes never left Mrs. Bantry's face. "The new lodger there, Mr. Hale, isn't it?" "He seems most respectable." "So did my second cousin before he ran off with his bookkeeper," Mrs. Bantry said with satisfaction. "I saw them myself on the coach to Bournemouth." Miss Marple sipped her tea, pretending to find nothing remarkable in the remark. But as she stirred the sugar, she recalled something. Mrs. Linton's hands, steady as stone when pouring her first cup, had begun to tremble at the mention of heritage claims a week earlier. People's nerves, she thought, were rather like fine china. One could tell their quality by the faintest crack. It was market day in St. Mary Mead, and the streets hummed with the amiable chaos of carts and chatter. Miss Marple, wrapped neatly in her blue shawl, moved among the stalls with her basket, listening, not obviously, but with that mild attention that made people forget she was listening at all. At the post office, she lingered behind 2 villagers discussing the week's post. "Strangest thing," said Mrs. Gubbins. 3 registered letters come through for something called the Rosemere Trust, addressed to the lane by Miss Marple's cottage they were. I told the clerk, but he said it was all proper." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Dear me, such an elegant name. Trusts are curious things, aren't they? So often they outlive their purpose," Mrs. Gubbins sniffed. "Mark my words, it's someone up to inheritance business. You'll see lawyers creeping about next." Miss Marple thanked her and bought 2 stamps she didn't need. That name, Rosemere, again. Like an echo from a place that refused to stay buried. By afternoon, clouds gathered over the village green, and Miss Marple found herself in the small library room at the parish hall. She had gone there ostensibly to return a gardening book, but soon found herself leafing through the St. Mary Mead Gazette, 1909 edition, bound in frayed leather. There, on the inside cover, was a faded advertisement. "Rosemere Trust seeks local subscribers for charitable works in domestic relief. Apply through vicarage or postmistress." She traced the lines with one gloved finger. "Charitable works," she murmured. Yes, they so often leave curious footprints. Behind her, the door creaked open. Mr. Pritchard shuffled in, his hat in hand and eyes darting like a guilty schoolboy's. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, hovering. "Didn't expect to find anyone in here. Just looking for the gardening section myself." "How very thoughtful of you, Mr. Pritchard," she replied, turning a page. "Though I believe the gardening shelves are by the window, not beside the parish ledgers." He coloured. "Oh, quite so. I must have lost my bearings." Miss Marple gave him her sweetest smile, which somehow made him more uncomfortable than a scolding would have. When he'd shuffled away, she slipped the Gazette closed and left the hall. That evening, a mild wind blew through the garden, stirring the rose bushes and carrying with it a faint scent of earth and damp. Miss Marple paused by the gate to straighten the latch, and noticed at once that someone else had done so earlier. There was a smudge on the brass, faint but visible, and her practised eye caught the difference. This was not soil from the lane. It was chalky, fine, pale grey, the kind one finds only in disturbed ground, not the tidy flower beds of her garden. She brushed it with a gloved finger, thoughtful. "Not quite the work of nature," she murmured. Inside she found a small envelope on her mat, pushed halfway under the door. There was no address, no stamp, only a pressed crest embossed faintly into the paper, a rose entwined with a pickaxe. The seal cracked softly as she opened it. Inside lay a fragment of tracing paper, part of a building plan, its edges torn. Rooms, perhaps, or cellars. At the top, written faintly in fading ink, Rosemere Lodge. She held it under the lamp and noted something peculiar. The outline of her cottage matched, but the drawing extended further to the rear, to a space that did not exist in her home, a chamber unmarked and windowless. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully, her expression serene, though her mind had leapt several steps ahead. Someone, it seemed, was determined to redraw the history of Rosemere Lodge. The next morning, she walked to the Bell Inn, ostensibly for a cup of tea. The air inside smelled faintly of beer and polish. Mr. Hale, the new lodger, sat in the corner with a newspaper and an untouched teacup. He was an elegant man, handsome in the dry, careful way of those who never truly rest. Miss Marple noticed his hands were strong, but marked with faint scratches, and his left cuff bore a trace of dried earth. "Such a pleasure to see new faces in the village," Miss Marple said kindly as she passed his table. He stood at once, all politeness. "The pleasure's mine, madam. I find small places rather restful." "One can think here," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, though it depends what one wishes to think about." Their eyes met briefly. His expression did not change, but she saw the flicker of calculation, the briefest pause before he folded his newspaper. "Quite so," he said softly. By the afternoon, the gossip had grown as thick as cream. Mrs. Bantry told Mrs. Clement that Mrs. Linton was in a state about missing letters. Mrs. Clement told the dressmaker that the new lodger was an archaeologist of questionable credentials. And the dressmaker told Miss Marple, very solemnly, that there's money buried somewhere about your house, and folk will dig for it, see if they don't. Miss Marple thanked her gravely. "Oh, I hope not. I'm very fond of my floorboards." But she thought long after of that phrase, "dig for it." The rain came that night in fine whispering sheets. Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting in hand, and noticed something odd in the reflection of the lamplight. A figure moving slowly past the gate, umbrella tilted low. She could not see the face, only the outline of the umbrella and the distinctive limp of Mrs. Linton. A minute later came a quiet clatter at the door, followed by silence. When she opened it, there was nothing on the step, only a faint smell of damp earth and lavender water. She waited, lamp raised, eyes calm and patient. But whoever had been there was gone. The next morning she found what had been left behind, a thin blue ribbon caught on the hinge of the cellar trap outside. Its edge was frayed, as though torn in haste. Miss Marple examined it carefully. She had seen that ribbon before, trimming the hem of Mrs. Linton's blue walking suit, and Mrs. Linton had sworn she'd been at home during the storm. At luncheon, Miss Marple paid a friendly visit to Mrs. Linton's shop. The woman was pale, her usual chatter brittle. "Terrible weather, Miss Marple," she said, fussing with the till. "Ruins the trade. People don't fancy errands in rain." "Quite," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "though I did see a brave soul out last night, blue umbrella and all. Most admirable in such weather." Mrs. Linton's hand jerked slightly, knocking over a stack of envelopes. "Indeed?" "Yes, indeed. One hates to think of anyone catching cold." For a moment, the younger woman's expression hardened, then smoothed again. "I dare say it was the postman." Miss Marple's smile was polite, but her eyes were sharp. "Yes, of course. The postman. They are such tireless people." As she left, she noted a faint trace of chalk under Mrs. Linton's fingernails. Tiny, pale grains that no respectable shop counter could account for. That evening, Miss Marple made herself a modest supper and sat down with her teacup. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate. She took the torn tracing paper from her sewing box and spread it beside the postcard she'd kept from the previous night. The outlines matched perfectly. Rosemere Lodge. The house that once was hers, and perhaps still was, in the mind of someone else. Outside the wind rustled the ivy, and the faintest sound came from below, the soft settling of timber, or perhaps the earth itself sighing beneath its secrets. Miss Marple folded the papers away and smiled to herself. A gentle, knowing smile that in her case always meant mischief was not far off. "And so," she said softly, "the story deepens." She poured another cup of tea, listening to the kettle hum, while the cottage settled into its evening hush. For most people, that hush would have been comforting. To Miss Marple it sounded like breath held before a revelation, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful. Chapter 3. The Gentleman with a Shovel and No Past. The first thing Miss Marple noticed about Mr. Hale that Sunday morning was the polish of his boots. Not their shine, anyone might polish shoes, but the evenness of it. The polish reached all the way to the sides of the soles, and only men who paid attention to impressions did that. He appeared at church just before the bell, tall and neatly dressed in a dark tweed suit, with a courteous bow to the vicar and an expression of modest piety. Newcomers were rare enough in St. Mary Mead, and polite ones rarer still. Mrs. Bantry whispered behind her hymn book, "That's the new gentleman at the Bell Inn. Came down from London, they say." "No one seems to know what he does." Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes on the hymnal. "Oh, one always knows what people do, dear. It simply takes a moment for them to tell us in their own way." The organ swelled. Birds chattered in the eaves. Yet, as she sang the verse, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the corner by the churchyard gate, where a shovel leaned casually against the stone wall, its blade faintly marked with reddish-brown earth. Ironstone, she thought. Not from any garden in the village. After the service, when the congregation spilled out in their usual mixture of chatter and shyness, Mr. Hale was already standing beside the gate, cap in hand. He greeted the vicar, complimented the sermon, and turned with gentle deference to Miss Marple. "Such a fine morning for reflection," he said warmly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, with that mild politeness which could be mistaken for innocence. "One always thinks best on a Sunday, though I imagine some people prefer to dig." A faint flicker crossed his eyes. "Dig, madam?" "Oh, for bulbs, you know," she said with a light laugh. "Or foundations." He inclined his head. "Indeed, I find the earth very instructive, Miss Marple. she smiled sweetly. "I dare say it teaches all sorts of things. If one only listens." As he turned to leave, she noticed a smear of soil on his left cuff, ironstone again, the same colour as the mark on the shovel. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage for tea. The vicar, an amiable man whose kindness occasionally ran ahead of his perception, was in high spirits. "Charming fellow, that Mr. Hale," he said, stirring his cup. "Well-read, quiet, most respectful. Says he's here to study old parish records. Family research, apparently." "Family research can be most absorbing," Miss Marple murmured. "Especially when one's family was well hidden." Mrs. Clement raised her eyebrows.
"Jane, you're always so suspicious." "Not suspicious, dear, merely observant," Mrs. Clement laughed.
But Miss Marple did not, because at that very moment a question had settled in her mind like a pin into soft wool. Why should a man who owned a perfectly new shovel be so interested in the oldest records of St. Mary Mead? 2 days later, as she took her usual stroll toward the green, Miss Marple passed by the chimney-sweep's cart outside her cottage. Joe Ellis, a cheerful lad with smudged cheeks, tipped his cap. "Morning, Miss Marple. Finished your flues proper. Bit of old paper caught up there, though. Tossed it out for you." "Oh?" she said, feigning mild interest.
"Paper, you say?"
He reached into his sack and produced a scrap, dusty and singed at the edge. Miss Marple took it delicately. It was a torn piece of parchment, faded and stiff, stamped faintly with a crest, a rose entwined with a pickaxe. Her heart gave a tiny, excited flutter, the same emblem as the mysterious letter. Oh dear.
"That must have been up there quite some time," she said smoothly.
"Thank you, Joe. So thoughtful of you." When the boy had gone, she examined it closely. It was not just any scrap. It bore the stub of a legal heading, Deed of Entitlement, Rosemere Lodge. A smile tugged gently at the corner of her mouth.
"Ah," she murmured.
"So someone has been tidying my chimney for reasons of their own." That evening, she walked down to the Bell Inn again. The place was quiet, only the ticking of the clock and the faint clatter of glasses. Mr. Hale sat by the fire, writing something in a small notebook. Miss Marple took a table near him, ordered a pot of tea, and listened. He was speaking softly to the innkeeper. "Yes, I should like to see the oldest parish maps, if that's possible, especially those showing boundary divisions. I'll make a donation, of course. Boundaries, is it?" said the innkeeper, curious. "You thinking of buying land, sir?" Mr. Hale's smile was faint. "Merely studying it." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. A man with an interest in maps, deeds, and family history, who also carried a shovel with ironstone on it, was not, she felt, a man here for leisure. The next morning brought a gusty wind and a swirl of gossip that reached even the vicarage. Mrs. Bantry came bustling up the lane, shawl fluttering. "Jane, you'll never guess. Mr. Pritchard's gone and pawned that brooch of his wife's, the one shaped like a compass rose. Says it's to raise capital, though for what, he wouldn't say." Miss Marple looked thoughtful.
"A compass rose? That's a curious choice to part with." "Well, it's not as if it's worth much," Mrs. Bantry sniffed.
Though Mr. Hale asked after it at the pawnbroker's, wanted to know where it came from. Did he now? Yes, strange man. Always walking out toward the quarry in the afternoons. Says he likes the view, but who likes staring at chalk pits? Miss Marple's eyes brightened just a little. Geologists, perhaps. Or men who have something to bury or to find. Mrs. Bantry blinked. "My dear Jane, how morbid you are." "Not morbid," said Miss Marple gently, only attentive. That evening she examined the pawn ticket for herself. The brooch indeed bore the same emblem. A tiny compass rose with a delicate pickaxe motif at the centre. A coincidence too tidy for Miss Marple's liking. She set out early the next morning and made her way down Old Mill Lane. The autumn wind carried a faint metallic tang, and the earth along the verge showed patches of disturbed chalk. 100 yards on, she found fresh footprints, large, booted, and unmistakably those of a man used to walking carefully. The prince led toward the disused quarry, and there, half hidden behind a fallen gate, stood a shovel. Its blade, dull now with use, bore again that familiar ironstone stain. Miss Marple stood looking at it for a long time, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. That afternoon, she found herself once again in conversation with the vicar and Mr. Hale at the vicarage. "Such a splendid old building," said Mr. Hale smoothly, looking around.
"So full of history. I was wondering, might one look at your parish records?"
"I'm tracing a family called Winterfield. They owned a property here once, Rosemere Lodge." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled.
"How extraordinary."
"That was the old name for my cottage." He looked at her, all polite astonishment. "Indeed. Then we are practically neighbours in time, Miss Marple. How delightful," she said.
"I do hope your search goes well."
"Though you must be careful. Old records can be quite misleading if not taken in the proper light." He smiled faintly.
"I assure you, Miss Marple, I am very careful with old things." She inclined her head.
"I'm sure you are." When he left, the vicar chuckled. "A pleasant fellow, don't you think?"
"Most," said Miss Marple softly.
"But it's curious. Men who are pleasant often carry very heavy shovels." The following morning, the postmistress called at her door with an envelope that had been wrongly delivered. It was addressed to Mr. H. Hale, Rosemere Lodge. Miss Marple accepted it with a gentle smile.
"Ah, yes."
"I believe he prefers the Bellin these days," but when she turned it over, she noted the handwriting. Tidy, precise, with ink blotted in one corner as though written hurriedly. The sender's name had been rubbed away, but faint traces remained. Linton and Co., legal surveyors, so Mrs. Linton's family firm, and Mr. Hale, it appeared, was not so solitary in his research after all. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the envelope before her, the compass brooch resting beside it. The pieces of the puzzle were taking shape, though the picture was not yet clear. A map with odd boundaries.
A forged deed fragment.
A left-handed visitor at her gate, and now correspondence between a nervous shopkeeper and a charming stranger. She took up her knitting, the needles flashing rhythmically in the firelight. "Left-handed," she murmured, "and fond of boundaries." Outside, the wind sighed through the rose bushes, carrying a faint scent of damp chalk. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled softly, as though marking time for secrets. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful. Chapter 4. Gossip, Gaps, and a Patch of Unseasonal Daisies. The first hint arrived at breakfast, not in the post or on the doorstep, but in the garden itself. A small, impertinent circle of daisies opening their white faces where no daisies had any right to be. They had come up in a tidy ring by the back step, as if they'd been invited, and their neatness was the most suspicious part. Miss Marple, teacup in hand, stood quite still in her kitchen doorway and thought how very obliging flowers could be when people had been careless with a spade. By the time her kettle had finished its soft little song, she had found 3 other things, a faint tamping of soil just beyond the step, as though someone had patted the earth into compliance, a crushed leaf of lemon balm under the water butt, still fragrant and very recently broken, and a single pale grit caught in the crack of the flagstone, chalky, not her garden's loam. She set her cup on the windowsill and allowed herself the smallest nod. Those daisies were not a whim of nature. They were an apology from the ground for being disturbed. The morning wore the fresh, unsettled look of a day that would not mind turning to rain. Miss Marple put on her hat, tucked her knitting into her bag, one must always appear to have other business, and set out for the Women's Institute sale in the parish hall, where charity and curiosity met on the best of terms. The path along the lane was pleasant enough, though she noticed that the ivy at her side gate had learned a new direction overnight, leaves bent and bruised where a coat hem had swept through. The latch, too, wore a faint scuff, bright as a wink. The same left-handed haste had returned. Inside the hall, gossip was laid out as generously as the sponge cakes. Tables clinked, coins chimed, and the rector's daughter tried valiantly to move a crocheted tea-cosy shaped like a plump hen. Mrs. Bantry's voice floated across the hubbub like a well-flung ribbon. "My dear, it's the oddest thing. Mr. Pritchard swears he never had a map at all, and yesterday he was waving it about like a flag at a parade. People often mislay things when they begin to be valuable," Miss Marple said, accepting a paper cup of tea. "It is remarkable how value improves memory and then spoils it altogether." Mrs. Bantry chuckled conspiratorially. "Between us, I think he's moved something to a higher shelf. He had that look about him, like a small boy who's hidden a pie." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, though her mind had already put the biscuit tin on the top shelf where it would be safe from short visitors and too tempting for tall ones. She let her gaze drift along the tables, lace doilies, jars of marmalade, a jumble of costume jewellery, and did not fail to notice Mrs. Linton hovering at the far end, lips tight and colour high, trying to sell a set of worn silver spoons with more boldness than the situation perhaps required. "Household funds," Mrs. Linton stated to no one in particular. "One does what one must in these times." "It's odd," said the dressmaker, at Miss Marple's shoulder, in a confidential murmur. "She had those same spoons polished up last month for the church luncheon. Said they were Linton family pieces.
Now she says they were a gift and never liked them at all." She sniffed approvingly at a cake, then added, "Also, I saw her leaving the Bell's back door yesterday, and it wasn't by chance."
She had her careful face on. Miss Marple thanked the dressmaker, bought a slice of ginger cake she didn't strictly want, and drifted to the raffle table. "How charming," she said to the vicar's wife, who managed the tickets. "Such a crowd." "Packed to the rafters," Mrs. Clement agreed, then dropped her voice just a fraction. "Jane, dear, if anyone asks, I have not got the old parish map out today."
"We had a misfiling."
"It will return to its drawer when I've mended a torn corner. Only you know how some men are when they smell paper older than themselves." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her bag as she tilted her head. "A torn corner? That happens when a page has been pinned. Or when someone is in a hurry," Mrs. Clement sighed. "Between us," Mr. Hale pressed, rather. "Perfect manners, naturally. But there's a way people touch old things. He touches them like keys." "Keys look better when they know which door they fit," Miss Marple murmured. "Quite," said Mrs. Clement, and coloured as though she'd said something improper when she had not. A small commotion near the charity books brought Miss Marple a fresh sliver of information. Mr. Pritchard, red in the face, stood wagging a rolled newspaper. "Now see here. Someone's been meddling at my shop. A customer went where he shouldn't and upset a tin that wasn't meant for him. Took a tumble, it did."
"Flour everywhere."
"Flour travels quickly," Miss Marple said mildly, retying her bag. "It improves the visibility of other tracks." He stared, then forced a laugh. "Ah, clever, Miss Marple. But I keep my things tidy, I do. Whoever touched it will learn manners." "People rarely learn them the way you hope," she returned, and offered him a raffle ticket. By the time she left the hall, the day had deepened to that grey which makes a village feel like a whisper. She took the path past the Bell Inn, not because she wished for a cup of tea, but because back doors, in her experience, told more honest stories than front ones. The inside yard was quiet, barrels stacked, a mop drained of its morning work. On the back doorstep lay 2 small clods of mud, drying at the edges in a way that spoke of recent separation. She crouched, carefully, for knees and reputations both, and saw at once the telltale flecks, white chalk within, not the gravel of the inn yard. That chalk belonged to the lane beyond her cottage and the quarry road. One did not track it by accident into warm kitchens. A whisper of lavender water teased her as she rose, the same fragrance that had clung to the envelope at her door, and faintly to the ribbon she had found. Lavender was common enough. Brand was not. Mrs. Linton favoured a particular kind that left a ghost of sweetness long after the wearer had gone. The scent hovered here, thin as a sigh. Inside the tap-room, the innkeeper looked up amiably.
"Afternoon, Miss Marple."
"Yours is the small pot and one scone, as ever? If it's not too much trouble," she said, settling near the fire. Mr. Hale, of course, sat with a notebook and an air of having just remembered something important. His voice, when he spoke, was perfectly pitched for low rooms and easy confidences. "I believe the council has misfiled survey indexes," he told the innkeeper. "No surprise there. I've offered to put them in order." "Can't have a village tripping over its own paper?" "How kind," Miss Marple murmured, just loud enough to float. "Paper trips those who have not learned to read it." If Mr. Hale heard, he did not show it, but the angle of his head changed, just a hair sharper, like a man tuning a violin string. Her scone arrived with a dab of jam. She ate half, thinking of daisies and chalk, and watched casually as Mr. Hale folded his notebook, slipped it into his inner pocket, and, as he rose, brushed an invisible crumb from his left cuff. There was nothing on the cloth to brush away. The gesture, like the man, was careful theatre. On her way home, Miss Marple stopped by Mr. Pritchard's shop. There, the top shelf over the counter held a familiar tin, biscuit on the outside, secrets within. Mr. Pritchard's attempt at casualness sat on his shoulders like an ill-fitting coat. "Candles, was it?" he asked too loudly. "Candles are always prudent," Miss Marple replied. "One never knows when a light will be mislaid." He boxed the candles, flustered, and in doing so left a perfect ring of flour on the lid of the tin. She smiled at it. The clean circle beside it, where a rolled paper had once lain, smiled back. "Do take care not to open that unless you mean to," she said kindly, nodding toward the tin. Mean to?" He blinked.
"Why should I open it?"
"Oh, one opens things by accident when friends call in a hurry. Haste is so clumsy with other people's shelves." His colour rose again. "Friends?"
"I've few enough."
"And those I have know better than to go rummaging." "Then I am sure they are very good friends indeed," she said, and left him to his thoughts. The afternoon folded into evening. In her kitchen, Miss Marple set the kettle going and laid out her knitting. But the rhythm of the needle's click-click pause was slightly off. She found herself, quite involuntarily, counting the steps between her back door and the place where the daisies had appeared. 11.5 on her stride, a tidy number, suspiciously so. People who measured once would measure again, and people who measured often began to behave as though doors would open for them merely because their pace was even. A soft tap-tap came at the side wall. Not a knock, a testing. She rose, lifted her shawl, and stepped into the dusk. No one in sight, merely the small noises of the village settling, a rake drawn across gravel, a cat declaring ownership of a fence, a distant bicycle bell. She looked down at the step and noticed a thread-like streak of dark polish on the stone, curved as though someone had balanced a shoe there and slipped slightly. The polish was fine and evenly applied. Miss Marple could have identified the brand if she had cared to keep such vulgar track. She did not. She had noticed the thing that mattered. The curve belonged to the left shoe, and the scuff on the latch had been left-handed. She slept lightly that night, the way one does when something is about to declare itself. Around 2, the wind shifted and pushed a murmur through the hedge. She heard, faint and delicate, the slight rasp of fabric against wood. The old floor beneath her warmed bed sent up a memory of the first scrape, the one that had started the matter, and it seemed to her that the cottage itself grew attentive, the way animals do when they're saint. Chapter 5. The rosemere riddle. It was Miss Marple's habit, whenever the village conversation became too noisy, to seek out those rare people who preferred to talk slowly. Mr. Penruddock, the retired solicitor who lived on the edge of St. Mary Mead, was one such treasure, a man who measured his words as carefully as he measured his sugar. That morning she called upon him ostensibly to borrow a recipe for quince chutney, though in truth she hoped for something more nourishing than preserves. Mr. Penruddock, delighted by visitors of any kind, received her in his study, a darkly comfortable room that smelled faintly of leather, pipe tobacco, and the dust of long-forgotten ledgers. "Quince, eh?" he said cheerfully, shuffling a stack of old magazines aside. "I used to make a fair go of it before the war. Must dig out the book." "I'm sure you had the patience for it," Miss Marple replied, eyes twinkling, "though I rather thought solicitors preferred to preserve secrets rather than fruit." He chuckled and poured her a modest glass of sherry. "Quite right, quite right. But I gave that up too. No one trusts the old sort of secret keepers anymore." Miss Marple sipped politely. "Oh, I think secrets still have their uses. They only change their disguises." That small remark, so gently placed, opened the door she wanted. "You'd be amused, Miss Marple," said Mr. Penruddock, leaning forward confidentially. "This very cottage of yours, what they call yours now, I mean, was once quite famous in its little way.
Rosemere Lodge, it used to be called.
Belonged to Miss Harriet Winterfield, an odd old spinster, rich as cream and twice as watchful." Miss Marple's knitting, which she had conveniently brought to appear unoccupied, clicked softly. Watchful, was she? Oh yes, had a way of seeing through doors without opening them, if you take my meaning. She took in evacuees during the war, poor little mites, and hid valuables for half the county. Said she kept them in a place no one would think to look. "How clever," Miss Marple murmured. "People rarely think to look where they themselves would never stoop to go." Mr. Penruddock chuckled again.
"Precisely."
But she was a queer bird. Never told a soul what became of the trust she administered. Some little fund for the widows and orphans, I believe. Died without issue, her papers scattered. The cottage was sold after the war, renamed, and everyone forgot about old Rosemere.
"Until now, it seems." Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "Until now?"
He gave her a wry smile. "There's been a bit of talk. A Mr. Hale called on me last week. Asked for any deeds relating to the Winterfield estate. Perfect manners, but too smooth for my liking. Said he was tracing a lost beneficiary. Funny thing, he knew the name Rosemere before I mentioned it." "How extraordinary," Miss Marple said softly. "Names are like ghosts. They appear when someone calls them." She thanked him for the recipe, which he never found, and walked back through the village with the air of a woman content after a social visit, though her thoughts marched briskly beside her. The wind had turned by afternoon, scattering dry leaves along the lane. Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage where Mrs. Clement was sorting a stack of parish magazines for the jumble sale. "Such rubbish," Mrs. Clement declared. "Old church bazaars, harvest rosters. Why we keep them I don't know." Miss Marple, eyes twinkling, took up one of the older issues. "One never knows when a bit of rubbish might speak," she said. "May I?" "By all means, dear." The paper was brittle, yellowed at the edges. She turned a page, and there, tucked between advertisements for boot repairs and piano lessons, was a small notice framed in neat black border: Rosemere Coal Club, winter allotments available. "Apply at the vicarage, Miss H. Winterfield, secretary." "Coal Club," Miss Marple murmured.
"How very interesting." Mrs. Clement looked up from her pile.
"Was that the year of the bad winter?"
"I do remember the talk of shortages." "Yes," Miss Marple said absently.
"And of hiding things in plain sight." At evensong, the air inside the church was cool and reverent, filled with the faint scent of polish and hymn books. Miss Marple took her usual seat, a little to the left of the nave, where she could see without being seen. Mr. Hale was there too, of course, always punctual, always well-groomed, the very model of urban politeness amid rustic charm. His lips moved with the prayers, but his eyes were restless. As the service drew toward its end, he knelt for communion, bowed his head, and, ever so discreetly, slipped a folded paper beneath the altar rail cushion. The gesture was practised, almost priestly. Miss Marple pretended to cough into her handkerchief, a mild sound that disguised the sharp note of understanding in her eyes. When the church had emptied, she lingered, murmuring to the vicar about the flowers,
until he was called away by a parishioner.
Then, in her unhurried way, she bent to adjust her shawl and drew from beneath the cushion a scrap of tracing paper. It was a rubbing, a floor plan, faintly smudged with graphite. Its corners were pricked, as if pinned once to a wooden board, and in the middle, neatly labelled in fading script, 2 words, Coal Store. The next morning, Miss Marple found Mrs. Linton arranging her shop window with uncharacteristic vigour. The woman's cheeks were high-coloured, and her manner, though brisk, carried a tension like that of a violin string drawn too tight. "Good morning," Miss Marple greeted pleasantly. "You've an eye for display, my dear? That new umbrella of yours is quite striking." Mrs. Linton's hand stilled for just an instant.
"Oh, this old thing. Hardly new?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled.
"I dare say it's seen a bit of the lane, though." The Ferrules gathered a most interesting souvenir. The younger woman frowned. "Pardon?" "A tip, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly, a trace of chalk inside.
"One does wonder how umbrellas manage to find their way into the earth." Mrs. Linton gave a small, brittle laugh. "You've the funniest fancies, Miss Marple. I was simply poking the soil about the garden." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly.
"One never knows what might grow when one does that." Mrs. Linton turned away, fussing with a ribbon, her fingers trembling slightly. "You make it sound as if I'd done something wrong." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said sweetly.
Gardening is a very honest occupation."
"It shows a person's patience and their curiosity." When Miss Marple left, she noticed that the shop bell tinkled twice behind her, though Mrs. Linton had not followed her out. The woman had turned the lock, a small act, but one of a person who suddenly remembered she had something to hide. That evening, Miss Marple prepared her cocoa and let the kettle sing a little longer than usual, the way one does when listening for something deeper than boiling water. On the table lay the rubbing of the plan, the postcard of Rosemere Lodge, and the small newspaper clipping about the coal club. The dotted lines of the plan ended abruptly at a blank square, a void beneath her very cottage. She tapped the edge of the paper thoughtfully.
"A coal store, is it?"
she murmured. "Or something that only pretended to be?" The house creaked softly in reply, as old houses do when reminded of secrets. Miss Marple's eyes went to the window, where the reflection of her lamp shivered on the glass. Somewhere out there, beneath her feet perhaps, lay the answer that Mr. Hale and Mrs. Linton were both chasing in such civilized haste. People, she reflected, rarely became brisk about anything unless there was money or memory at stake, and legends, like buried coals, had a way of glowing long after the fire was supposed to be out. She took a sip of her cocoa, savouring its warmth, and let the silence settle comfortably around her. The puzzle had declared itself now, though not yet its meaning. Someone in St. Mary Mead was digging for a story, and before they were done, the ground itself might begin to talk. Miss Marple smiled her gentle, knowing smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. For she had learned, long ago, that beneath the polite talk of tea and roses, some people would trade anything to own a legend, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the cobblestones slick and shining like polished pewter. Morning came shyly to St. Mary Mead, with a thin mist curling along the hedges and the faint smell of damp coal smoke in the air. Most of the village was still dozing when Miss Marple, wrapped in her soft grey shawl, sat down to breakfast. Her kettle hissed. The clock ticked its modest rhythm, and all seemed perfectly ordinary until she noticed the soot on the window latch. It wasn't from the fire, nor from the sweep. Someone, she thought mildly, had touched it from outside. Now that, she said softly, isn't the work of the wind. She took her tea to the window and watched the lane. The early milk cart passed, followed by Mrs. Bantry's maid with a letter for the post, and then silence returned. But she could still feel it, that faint, watchful stillness that old houses sometimes wore like a shawl of their own. And when night came again, that stillness broke. The clock on her mantel had just struck 11 when she heard it, a muffled thud. Then the faintest scrape outside her sitting-room window. Miss Marple put down her knitting and waited. There it was again, careful, deliberate, like a step pressed too softly. Someone was in her garden. She moved quietly to the window and, parting the curtain just a finger's width, saw them. 2 shadows moving among the lilacs. One, tall, walking with a confident stride, Mr. Hale. The other, shorter, hesitant, turning back every few steps as if expecting to be called home, Mrs. Linton. Miss Marple's pulse did not quicken. It merely steadied itself. She drew the curtain to, lit her lamp as if nothing were amiss, and sat down again, knitting resuming its calm, domestic rhythm. Outside, the footfalls paused near her back wall. Then a low murmur, indistinct but strained. She caught only fragments carried on the damp air. Ledger.
Wrong corner.
You said the key.
Not yet.
She's watching. Then, after a silence, footsteps retreating, separately. She waited a few minutes longer, then rose, fetched her candle, and went to the hallway. The faintest draught breathed up from the floorboards near the hearth. Ah, she murmured, so that's where the whisper lives. The next morning, she was at the grocer's early, and the talk was lively, as talk in St. Mary Mead always was, after a night that had felt vaguely eventful. "Strange goings-on," Mr. Pritchard declared, lowering his voice with satisfaction. "My biscuit tin moved itself, it did. I put it on the top shelf last night, and this morning lowered down just so. Nothing taken, mind you, but it's the principle." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Perhaps your conscience was tidying." He chuckled uneasily. "If it was, it's a meddling conscience." And the flower on the counter was disturbed, swept to one side as if something rolled there. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Rolled, you say? Like a scroll, perhaps?" "Could be," he said, not catching the gleam in her eye.
Anyway, I've moved the tin to a locked cupboard now.
"Let them try." "Locks, dear Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple said. "Only comfort the honest." He laughed, unsure whether she was joking, as she left the shop. The baker's wife called across the street. "You've heard?"
I expect Mrs. Linton's brooch turned up at the pawnbroker's again. Bought back by herself this time.
"Must have missed it, something awful." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, some things do come back when one least expects them." And indeed, when she passed Mrs. Linton's window an hour later, the brooch gleamed proudly on her lapel once more. A compass rose, gold edges bright against blue wool. Only one thing was different. The little stone at its centre was gone. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on the vicarage. Such visits were always useful. The vicar's study was a hub for gossip, disguised as good works. She found Mrs. Clement there with the parish accounts, and the vicar himself in mild exasperation over an untidy pile of maps. "Old boundary surveys," he explained when she looked amused. "Mr. Hale was kind enough to bring these from the council office."
I can't make sense of half of them. Perhaps they're not meant to make sense, Miss Marple said lightly, examining one. Ah, see here, the date has been trimmed.
"How odd to remove the year and nothing else," the vicar frowned. "Why would anyone do that?" "To make an old map look newer, or a new one look old," Miss Marple replied, folding it gently. "Forgery is an art that begins with scissors," Mrs. Clement gasped. "Jane, you think Mr. Hale—" Miss Marple shook her head kindly.
"Oh, my dear, I think nothing at all."
"But men who know too well what they're looking for seldom stop to ask whether they should be looking at all." She stayed for tea, smiling and nodding through the vicar's stories. while her mind quietly rearranged the puzzle, forged dates, a hidden ledger, the compass brooch with its missing stone, and that scrap of tracing paper from the church, coal store. By the time she walked home, the day had turned to dusk. That night, she measured. With crochet thread and patience, she paced her hallway from the front door to the hearth 11 feet exactly. She checked the floor plan rubbing, 13 feet marked between walls, 2 feet unaccounted for. Someone long ago had built her cottage with an extra pocket of space. 2 feet, she murmured, is enough to hide a sin or a secret. As she said it, she thought she heard something, a soft click outside, like the gate latch being lifted, then gently set down again. She crossed the room, lamp in hand, and stood by the curtain. Through the lace, the garden lay still and silver in the moonlight, but near the hedge she saw the faint glimmer of something metallic. A dropped key, perhaps?
Or the reflection of a watch chain.
She stepped closer to the glass, careful not to breathe on it. Then a movement, a shadow slipping between the lilacs, soundless, deliberate, Mr. Hale again. He paused by the daisies, bent slightly, and did something quick with his hand, then straightened and vanished toward the lane. Miss Marple did not move until he was gone. Then she smiled, slow and thoughtful. "Planting or digging, my dear sir? The difference is in what one expects to grow." The next day dawned bright and falsely innocent. Birds sang as though nothing in the world could possibly be secret. At the post office, Mrs. Gubbins greeted her with a flourish. "You've heard about Mrs. Linton's misfortune, I suppose?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl.
"Not yet.
"But I'm sure I soon shall." "Someone's been through her cupboards," Mrs. Gubbins declared with relish. "Nothing taken but the drawers disturbed. She says she suspects a tramp, but between us, well, it's not tramps that leave boot polish smudges and lavender scent behind." Miss Marple nodded. "No, indeed. Tramps prefer stronger perfumes." That afternoon, she strolled past the Linton shop. Mrs. Linton stood outside, pale and strained, rearranging a vase of violets with nervous care. "Dear me, Mrs. Linton," Miss Marple said kindly, "you must be exhausted with all the tidying." The woman jumped slightly.
"Tidying?"
"Yes. After all, one cannot keep a house in order without turning out drawers now and again. Dust hides everywhere." Mrs. Linton's hands stilled. "If you mean the mess this morning, I had nothing to do with it." "Oh, I never thought you did," Miss Marple said softly. "I was only wondering whether you'd yet found what you were looking for." Their eyes met. Mrs. Linton's composure cracked for half a breath, then mended itself. "You have the oddest way of putting things, Miss Marple." "So people tell me," she said cheerfully, and went on her way. That evening, the sky grew heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple lit her fire early and set her teapot on the hob. The house seemed to listen with her as she sat in her chair, knitting moving in steady rhythm. A knock came at the door. When she opened it, Mr. Hale stood there, hat in hand, his smile perfectly courteous. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I was passing and thought to inquire whether you've had any trouble with—"
"Trespassers, perhaps?"
"Someone's been about the lanes at night." "How thoughtful of you," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Yes, I did notice a gentleman taking the air rather late. Quite tall, rather fine boots. Left-handed, I believe." For the briefest moment his smile faltered.
"Ah, then you're quite safe, I'm sure." "I do hope so," she said.
"The village is such a trusting place." He inclined his head, his composure returning. "Indeed, that's what makes it charming." When he had gone, Miss Marple closed the door and leaned lightly against it, eyes amused. "Charm," she said aloud, "is very good camouflage." Before bed, she went once more to the hearth and lifted the edge of the rug. The faint seam she'd noticed weeks ago was still there, almost invisible, but running straight and true. Her fingers traced it lightly, and the hollow sound beneath confirmed what she already knew. Something lay below. Perhaps the old coal store. Perhaps something older. She replaced the rug, straightened it carefully, and stood gazing at the fire until the embers settled into a slow red glow. Two people in St. Mary Mead were chasing Rosemere's secret, and both believed they could do it unseen, but the house itself, she thought, had begun to stir. Outside, the wind rose, and from somewhere near the gate came a soft metallic tinkle, the sound of something small falling onto stone. In the morning, she would find it, a tiny gold clasp shaped like the point of a compass rose, broken clean away, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful. Chapter 7: The Trapdoor and the Tale. The House. Told the morning after the windstorm dawned clear and sharp, the sort of morning that made the entire village of St. Mary Mead smell faintly of wet leaves, wood smoke, and secrets. Miss Marple, however, did not greet it with her usual serenity. She had been awake since 5, her mind busy arranging facts like teacups on a tray. There was the seam in her floor, the compass rose clasp by the gate, Mr. Hale's too smooth manners, and Mrs. Linton's nervousness disguised as indignation. And somewhere beneath her very hearth, a space that the house itself seemed reluctant to remember. Really, she murmured to her reflection in the teapot, one might think the cottage is trying to say something, and when houses tried to speak, Miss Marple knew it was polite to listen. That afternoon, she paid a brief and entirely innocent visit to the vicar. "Just a little borrowing, dear," she said, standing at his doorway with her best Sunday expression. "I wondered if I might make use of the old bell clapper from the church storeroom, such a solid piece of metal, and it makes an excellent weight for drying flowers." The vicar blinked, then beamed. "Why, of course, Miss Marple. A bell clapper."
Ingenious, as always. She thanked him and walked home, the clapper wrapped neatly in brown paper under her arm. At tea, she told herself that one mustn't be hasty, that curiosity was a slippery slope.
But by twilight she was on her knees before the hearth, tapping gently along the floorboards. Tap, tap, tap. The first few notes were solid and respectable, but then a hollow sound answered back, muffled and deep.
From beneath the rug. "Ah," she whispered, her eyes alight.
"There you are." She fetched a small screwdriver from her mending box and lifted the rug corner. Her fingers found a faint groove, and then a recessed iron ring, cleverly waxed over. She slipped the screwdriver under it, and with a quiet sigh of surrender, the trapdoor lifted. The smell that rose was cool and dusty, tinged with old coal and something else, something metallic, like the memory of coins. She fetched her candle, leaned down and saw a narrow ladder descending into a small, bricked chamber. A coal store, yes, but not merely coal. At the bottom, she found an old wooden box, oilcloth wrapped, stamped faintly with the emblem of a rose entwined with a pickaxe. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Rosemere to the last. The latch gave easily under her touch. Inside lay a tin strongbox, once bright, now dulled by time. Its lock was broken, forced long ago. She lifted the lid and found not jewels nor gold, but paper, bundles of it, yellowed, creased, bound with faded ribbon. Atop the pile lay a small ledger, its cover marked Rosemere Relief Fund. Inside, pages of neat handwriting, names, dates and amounts, small sums given for coal, rent, or the keeping of evacuee children during the war. At the back of the ledger, tucked between the pages, an unsigned letter. "Trust no map newer than the war. The false boundaries will betray the true." The final line was blotched, as if written in haste. Miss Marple closed the book thoughtfully.
"So that's what you were guarding, my dear Miss Winterfield?" she murmured.
"And what others would rather claim as their own," the candle flickered. She noticed, just then, a faint scent lingering in the air. Sweet, unmistakable. Lavender water, Mrs. Linton's fragrance, delicate but stubborn. She turned the candle toward the wall. There, against the low beam, was a fresh scuff mark, a scrape that showed pale wood beneath the dust, as though something had brushed against it recently. And on the floor beside the box, the faintest trace of boot polish, iron grey, Mr. Hale. She smiled softly, not in alarm but in satisfaction. "Two hands, one box," she said, "and each pretending the other doesn't exist." By morning, her plan was made. She tidied the trapdoor, replaced the rug, and put the kettle on. The cottage looked as serene as ever. That afternoon, she made 2 very pleasant visits, one to Mrs. Linton, one to Mr. Hale. At Mrs. Linton's shop, she was all sweetness and light. "My dear, I simply must have a new ribbon," she said. "Something cheerful for spring, though of course blue suits you best." Mrs. Linton, pale but polite, busied herself at the counter. "You're kind to say so, Miss Marple. It's been a trying week, I dare say," Miss Marple said gently.
It's difficult keeping up appearances when one's
"Under pressure." The ribbon in Mrs. Linton's hands trembled slightly.
pressure. Oh, yes, Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling.
"You strike me as a person who dislikes being left out of a plan, especially one involving your late uncle's business papers." Mrs. Linton froze, then forced to laugh. "You've been listening to gossip, Miss Marple."
That's all nonsense, of course, Miss Marple said soothingly. The best gossip always is. She bought her ribbon, paid with exact change,
and left Mrs. Linton staring after her. Her call at the Bell Inn was equally civil. Mr. Hale received her in the front parlour, his manner courteous as ever. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "what a pleasant surprise."
A little tea, perhaps?
"Only if it's no trouble," she replied. "I was merely passing and thought I might ask your opinion on something, maps in particular." "Maps?" he repeated, his tone light but wary. "Oh, yes," she said, drawing a folded paper from her basket. "This one rather puzzles me. Such odd dotted lines, and then a blank square at the centre, almost as though something had been left out deliberately." He leaned forward, his composure smooth but his fingers too still. "A draft, perhaps, or misprint." "Ah," she said mildly.
You must be right.
"Though it's strange, isn't it, how the square fits precisely beneath my sitting room." For a moment he did not breathe. Then he smiled again, that perfect smile. "You're quite the detective, Miss Marple." "Oh, not at all," she said sweetly. "I simply notice when people walk too softly." He laughed, but there was steel in it.
Then you must hear a great deal. Indeed, she said, rising.
"And I find people always tell one everything, if one listens kindly enough." That night she waited. She had not meant to, but she knew they would come. At 11:30, the latch on her gate clicked. 2 sets of footsteps, one firm, one hesitant. The whisper of fabric. A woman's low murmur, urgent. Then the faint creak of the back door latch. Miss Marple, sitting calmly in her chair, reached for the small handbell she had borrowed from the vicarage, now conveniently fitted with the clapper she had borrowed that morning. She rang it once, lightly. The sound, soft yet sharp, cut through the cottage like a warning. There was a gasp, a hurried step, then silence. When she opened the door, the garden was empty. Only a few footprints marked the damp path side by side until halfway down, where they split apart.
One led toward the lane.
The other curved back toward the house and stopped by the daisies. There, in the half-dug soil, was the corner of a small piece of paper. She knelt and lifted it delicately. It was the last page from the ledger, blotted ink. A single faint fingerprint pressed in the corner, narrow, fine-boned, unmistakably a woman's. And over the ink, a faint lavender stain, Mrs. Linton's hand.
Writing, or perhaps stealing, a confession. Miss Marple replaced the page where she'd found it.
smoothed the soil and went inside. The trapdoor, she knew, would not be safe much longer. But the truth rarely was. She set the kettle to boil, and as the steam rose, she considered how best to end such impoliteness without ever raising her voice. By morning, St. Mary Mead was humming again. The postmistress declared she'd seen someone by Miss Marple's hedge at midnight. Mr. Pritchard swore his dog had barked at shadows. Mrs. Bantry arrived at the door before breakfast.
Practically glowing with excitement. My dear Jane,
You must have heard. The police are inquiring about forged property claims. They say a solicitor's clerk has been circulating false deeds. Imagine,
indeed,
said Miss Marple, buttering her toast.
how very enterprising. Apparently some London man is suspected, Mr. Hale of all people.
Though I can't think why. Charming manners and such nice shoes. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. Yes, shoes tell one everything. They go everywhere their owners would rather they hadn't. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. But you don't think it's true, do you? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that truth, like coal, is often buried until someone lights the right fire. She smiled kindly and offered Mrs. Bantry another slice of toast. That afternoon, she replaced the ledger and papers inside the box beneath her floor, locked it again, and sealed the trap-door with quiet finality. Some secrets, she thought, must rest where they belong, guarded by those who understand their weight. And as she settled by the fire, the house seemed to breathe more easily, as though its confession had finally been heard. Outside, the village bell tolled the hour, steady and calm. The sound drifted through her window like reassurance. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her eyes thoughtful but serene. Someone had come perilously close to the truth last night. Someone else was already running from it, but St. Mary Mead, in its gentle way, was closing ranks, as it always did when sin brushed too near the hedgerows. Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea, smiled into the steam, and whispered to the quiet air, "There now, the house has told its tale, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful." Mr. Pritchard followed, smelling of flour and self-importance. "Afternoon, Miss Marple."
I don't say I've got anything to add, mind, but there's been talk of a map.
"And when there's a map, there's my shop. And when there's my shop, there's me." "Of course there is," Miss Marple returned kindly. "Please sit near the window. The light flatters you." He sat, surprised into docility. Mrs. Linton came next, pale and brisk, her hat pinned at a firm angle that suggested she did not intend to be moved by anything, not even truth. The compass rose brooch was pinned high, flashing bravely, and the tiny vacancy where the centre stone should have been looked, if one knew how to look, like an eye that had cried itself carefully dry. "Thank you for asking me," she said, too loudly. "I am quite at leisure." The way she set her gloves on the tablecloth was a small domestic clue in itself. She aligned each finger exactly with its pair, as though the certainty of matching things could protect her from a world that refused to match at all. Mr. Hale arrived last, naturally, all apologies and ease. "1,000 thanks for including me, Miss Marple. I've been longing to pay my respects properly. One hears your tea is a village treasure." His tone held that lightness professionals wear when they're measuring a room's exits as they speak. "Tea is a poor thing unless it's shared," Miss Marple said mildly. "Do have the chair facing the hearth." He paused half a second before taking it. A very small pause, but the kind that belongs to men accustomed to invisible edges. They were settled. Cups went round. The clock ticked like a contented hen. Outside, a late breeze fretted the ivy and tapped the side gates softly, like a guest who had changed their mind and gone away. "Shall we have a story?" Miss Marple asked gently.
I think we ought.
The sort with a beginning tucked into the middle and an end that remembers where it came from. Mrs. Bantry, who had slipped in uninvited and installed herself as audience, clapped her hands.
Do, she said, please.
I'm quite starved. Miss Marple's knitting lay unused in her lap. Once this cottage had a different name, she began, in that warm, confiding tone that made people lean forward without meaning to. Rosemere Lodge. It belonged to Miss Harriet Winterfield, who was not so much odd as careful. During difficult years, she took in evacuees, minded their small treasures, and kept a ledger of the village's quiet kindness, coal, rent, bread, a shawl here and there. She hid these records and now and then modest funds in a place no one would think to look. Her eyes drifted to the rug, which is the only place worth hiding anything. A gossip breath from the room. Under the hearth?
Heavens! That was Mrs. Bantry, obliging on schedule. Mr. Hale smiled pleasantly.
Charming tale, but the world turns, even in St. Mary Mead. Old names sink. Yes, Miss Marple agreed.
Unless someone throws a rope to pull them up again. I imagine the rope might look like a survey map.
Perhaps an old one trimmed and spliced to suit a new story.
Or a new one aged with coffee and put in an old drawer. Mr. Hale, would you take a little more seed cake?
It is easier to keep one's hands from fidgeting when they are occupied. The smallest ripple ran around the room. Mr. Hale's smile did not alter, but his fingers moved to his lap, empty and still. Mr. Pritchard huffed.
I never...
Well, I may have the odd thing on a top shelf, but I don't go in for splicing, Miss Marple. No, indeed, Miss Marple agreed, eyes kind. A man who stands behind a counter all day learns to keep his edges square. Someone moved your biscuit tin, though. Someone taller than you with flour briefly on his cuff. And later, someone shorter. Someone who stood on tiptoe and could not quite reach. Mrs. Linton's colour rose and fell like a nervous tide.
This is very irregular, she said steadily.
If there is some dispute, the proper place is the solicitor's office. How sensible, Miss Marple murmured, especially if one has a family connection to a firm that occasionally files surveys for country lanes. It would save a gentleman the trouble of rooting about in parish drawers. That was the first true change in the room. Mr. Hale's tone, when it came, had a new gloss to it, like polish laid too quickly. You put things very prettily, Miss Marple, but we deal in facts.
Where are they, these facts? On the firelight, I think, she said.
Truth likes warmth. She reached, calmly, without theatre, beneath the chair beside her and lifted a tin strong-box, oilcloth wrapped, its dull surface stamped with a rose and a pickaxe. She set it on the tablecloth, and the little sound it made carried like a bell. Mr. Pritchard exhaled a reverent "Oh!" Mrs. Clement pressed a hand to her throat. Mr. Hale did not move at all. Miss Marple opened the box. Inside, neatly stacked, lay the ledger and folded papers. "Rosemere Relief Fund," she said softly. "The story of a village being itself." She took up the ledger and turned to the last page. Someone looked here in a hurry.
See the smudge?
It is lavender water, Mrs. Linton's brand, not common in the shops now. She handled it last night, or perhaps the night before, when she had a conversation by my lilac hedge about a key that was not where it was meant to be. Silence. Delicate and ringing, Mrs. Linton swallowed. If I walked by your hedge, it was only because... She trailed off. Miss Marple's voice was all gentleness. Because you discovered there were two players at your game, my dear. One who promised to share if you helped find a box beneath an old house and kept her quiet, and one who meant to keep everything tidy, so tidy, in fact, that people would disappear from the tale if they did not contribute to the neatness. You saw Mr. Hale measure and mark. You followed his steps and found the ring in the floor, but the lock wanted a hint. Happily, the centre of your compass rose brooch was once a very practical stone cut to a slender wedge. It opened a box a certain lady meant to open only for kindness, A small, shocked gossip breath from the vicar's wife. "A key and a brooch."
How dreadfully clever. Mrs. Linton's hands went to the brooch as if to defend it.
She whispered. "It was my uncle's years ago. He told me it once had a use." Her voice shifted, almost pleading. "But I did not take anything." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, and meant it. "You looked, you read, you touched the ledger and left your scent behind, and you kept your nerve when a gentleman suggested you had none. That is a fault of gentlemen. They underestimate nerves kept in tidy drawers, all eyes."
As they will went to Mr. Hale, he remained composed.
But there was a new angle to the mouth, a flat line where humour had retired. "And here," Miss Marple went on, turning the page with a librarian's careful pride, "is the other fact. The cut along the margin, see the tiny pressure burrs? They are made by a left-handed blade, and the survey donated to the vicarage has a date shaved away with the same hand. Your cuffs are very clean, Mr. Hale, but the invisible marks remain."
I should imagine your craft is not family history at all.
"It is the arranging of histories to suit present needs."
A simple matter if no one is listening. For the first time, Mr. Hale's voice changed.
The velvet withdrew. Steele remained. "This is village theatre," he said quietly. "Old wives' recipes and floorboard fables. You have no proof." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, with a mild brightness that in her meant finality, "I have the sort of proof people prefer, a story that rings true in the right ears. But if you insist upon objects, we have those too. The clasp from Mrs. Linton's brooch, found by my gate, where someone dropped it in haste, a rubbing of a plan you placed beneath an altar cushion, which is a charming habit for a man who respects lines more than promises. The parish notice of the Rosemere Coal Club, explaining why a coal store would have been worth using as a hiding place. And finally, the ledger itself, untouched by you, though you tried. You see, I recognized the scent in the coal store. Your polish and Mrs. Linton's lavender together made a most unlikely marriage." It was not triumph that softened her voice then, but regret, the sort one keeps for cleverness used on the wrong side of the ledger. "You are very able, Mr. Hale. You might have done something honest with it." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked, not at Miss Marple, but at the vicar's wife. "A trust," he said evenly. "Funds lying forgotten.
Legacy in legal limbo.
What could be more sensible than bringing it into active hands?" "Your hands?" Mrs. Clement asked, with a firmness Miss Marple had known she possessed all along. "Capable hands," he corrected gently. Miss Marple slid the ledger toward the centre of the table, a quiet domestic coronation. "Capable hands," she repeated, "have a way of confusing themselves with rightful ones. The village will restore what was intended, the ledger, to Mr. Penruddock, who remembers the old signatories, the notice to the parish chest. The small remaining funds, there are some, tucked among these papers, to the relief of those still keeping misses." Linton's eyes filled, angry tears at first, then something else.
"I didn't want to take anything," she said, in a rush that sounded like confession and defense together. "I only wanted to be included."
"All my life I've been told things after the fact. He said there was a share for me if I helped him with the plan. But when the time came—" She stopped, swallowed, and turned toward Mr. Hale. "You were going to cut me out?" He did not deny it. He merely composed himself and addressed Miss Marple as though they were two professionals comparing notes.
"And if I don't agree to your tidy parish solution?"
"Then," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "Mr. Pritchard will remember who touched his top-shelf WT